You are listening to The Airing Cupboard, the podcast where the extraordinary stories of ordinary people get an airing. Phew, that's a mouthful. Hello and welcome back into The Airing Cupboard. Long time no see. You thought I had forgotten you, don't you? No, I have not. I think the last time I sat in this cupboard was in May. Why have I left it so long? Life has been very busy, but that isn't really an excuse, as I'm the first one to know that I can always create time for what I love. No, I don't think time has been lacking. I think what has been lacking is space. Not the space around me, but the space inside me to write and to create. But here I am today. And out of all days, today is winter solstice here in the Northern Hemisphere, the shortest day of the year, the darkest day. And that rejoices me tremendously, as from tomorrow, things will be on the up, with a bit more light every day. Phew. But that isn't the reason why I came back into my cupboard today, winter solstice or other. The reason I am sitting here amongst my duvets, pillows, sleeping bags, towels, is that it is almost Christmas, and I wanted to thank you all for your loyalty towards this little project, so close to my heart. A project that is still growing on its own, gaining more listeners despite my silence. And I know that you are the reason for it, because you must be speaking about it with your friends and family and sharing the link. So I want to say thank you. I am here today because I want to give you a little story for Christmas, my present to you. So sit yourself down or lie under the Christmas tree, digest that turkey, suck on a toffee and settle better. But before I start, I must do a shout out to some special listeners. So this summer I met, by some sort of coincidence, a listener of the Airing Cupboard. He told me rightly that I often speak with great excitement about the faraway countries where I notice new listeners through my little analytical tool, like Georgia or Costa Rica or Iran. And he said, when is she ever going to notice the high volume of downloads in my neck of the woods? So, my friends in Leeds, a very special shout out to you and your vibrant city. Okay, Zoe, enough gibberish for now, and let's get on with the story. The story today comes from Greg. Greg is now in his late 40s and lives in Edinburgh, Scotland. This isn't his real name, as the story is so personal to him. He wanted to remain anonymous, and so I have also changed some of the details and places of this story. The voice you will hear is not his, but that of Daryl, who went through similar events and kindly accepted to share some of his thoughts with us. While listening to Daryl's audio, it dawned on me that I could have also told Daryl's story, equally extraordinary. But as you listen, you will realize I could have probably told the story of 1,000 men. They had met on the benches of a lecture hall of the School of Biological Sciences at the University of Edinburgh. It was a grey November morning in 1995. He was 20. He was sitting a little above her and hadn't noticed her at first. But as the lecturer had started rambling on and on about molecular ecology, his attention had drifted, and, chewing on the end of his pen, his gaze had wandered on the people sitting below him. And he had seen her, well, just the back of her. She was wearing a deep blue hand-knitted jumper which she seemed to be wearing on bare skin. It had slightly come off her left shoulder, showing her paleness. Her brown hair was gathered in a messy bun at the top of her head, which she was holding high and with grace, slightly tilted as if she was intently listening to the lecture. She had an unusual long neck with a little dark mole in what Greg knew as her supraclavicular fossa, that little indentation immediately above the clavicule at the bottom of her neck. Was she feeling observed? Was his gaze warming the back of her neck? Maybe, because she started fidgeting, rubbing the base of her head, her shoulder, pulling back her blue jumper over it. He was transfixed. And then she had turned back, and she had looked straight at him. Her oval face was half hidden by large reading glasses, but beneath it, on the full, plump lips, a slight smile had formed. Was it because his pen was still in his mouth that Greg had been unable to reciprocate? By the time he had regained his spirits, the moment had passed, and she was looking ahead again. But the spell was cast. That night, as Greg laid flat on his bed in the darkness of his student rooms, the palms of his hands resting on his chest, images of deep blue jumper, pale skin, long neck fluttered across his open eyes. And when he started wondering how it would feel to undo that messy bun and let the hair cascade down to that little mole at the bottom of her neck, he felt his heart beat a little faster under his hand, and something stirred deep inside him. From that day, Greg developed a renewed interest for molecular ecology and never missed a lecture. He would seek her amongst the students and would soon discover her in yet another colourful hand-knitted jumper that she always seemed to wear on bare skin. They often smiled at each other across the auditorium but never spoke. One day he even risked a little wave, which he immediately regretted, finding himself pathetic. Even more so that evening when he mimicked it to himself in the mirror of his room. As he looked at his reflection, his thin arms, his flat torso, he was resolute to hit the exercise routine harder the next morning. That body of his. Was it masculine enough for such a woman? Would she be attracted? If only he could bulk out a bit, then maybe he would sum up the courage to approach her. But he needed not to worry, because she did before any muscle had appeared on his chest. She had simply sat next to him one day at lecture, and then, for the first time, he saw the eyes behind the oversized reading glasses. Brown, warm, kind, intelligent, and slightly mischievous. She was called Claire. She enjoyed knitting. That explained the array of jumpers. Running, dancing, and cooking, but she sucked at patisseries because her hands were too warm and melted the butter. And that saddened him a bit because he loved patisserie. But soon he found out about the warmth of her hands, and he never thought about patisserie ever again. They were married on a June afternoon 4 years later on her father's farm in Wiltshire, and that night, as they danced in front of all their friends and family, Greg badly and Claire gracefully, he held her tight, his lips resting lightly on that little mole in the hollow of her neck, her supraclavicular fossa, that little bit of her he loved so well. Greg got a job at the University of Edinburgh, working in research in biological sciences, while she worked for a pharmaceutical firm on the edge of town. He liked it there, the quiet atmosphere, the white coats, the precise gestures, the measured procedures. They bought an apartment right in the heart of the city. The space was small, with just 2 little bedrooms, but the living room was bright and the light came flooding in during the mornings. And it was their little nest. It was cozy, comfortable. His favorite days were Sunday, where they would laze about in bed under the duvet, unhurried. And when they felt replete with rest and tenderness, He would get up, make a large pot of tea, and they would sit at the old pine table, sunlight pooling onto the golden grain of its wood, in front of each other. He would work on some of his research papers while she knitted, one leg down, the other folded against the chest, foot tucked under her bottom. And when they had enough of that, they would get dressed and go down for a brunch of avocado and poached eggs on toast in their favorite little cafe on the corner of the Haymarket. And the day would stretch into walks through the cobbled streets of the city, visits to bookshops, train rides to the North Berwick beach, and often an early meal at a low-key restaurant in the Botanical Gardens. And it was during one of those Sundays that they had the short conversation that was going to change their lives. It was Claire that had tacitly instigated it as they sat in front of their brunch in the little cafe. At the next table, there was a young couple with a baby. The baby was asleep on the father's chest, his face squished against his shirt, its little lips pouting in a pink flower. Claire had watched them, and Greg had watched Claire. And when Claire looked back at him, there was an undeniable question in her brown eyes, one that didn't need to be enunciated. So Greg simply leaned across the table and whispered in her ears, "Yes, let's have a baby." And her eyes turned warmer and darker as she looked straight at him with yet another question. So he leaned across again and whispered, "Now." They walked first, then ran through the cobbled streets, hand in hand, laughing, climbing the old stone step, two at a time, never stopping, eager to be back in their little nest, consumed with desire for each other, with desire to conceive a new life. Greg told me they had always enjoyed a good sex life together, but from that time on, and for the few months that followed, it became magical, knowing that each embrace in insouciance could be the promise of a child, a loved child, their child, knowing that the woman he was holding in his arms would soon harbor a son or a daughter of his. In their infatuation and excitement for their future as a family, they decided to put their small apartment for rent and move to the countryside into a bigger place. A garden would be amazing for children to play in. Greg would commute and Claire would go part-time. Was he sure about the move? No, he wasn't. He felt the apartment would easily welcome a child, but Claire was so elated about this change of life and surroundings that her dream became his. And so they moved into their new home, a bigger space that felt somehow a little empty at first, and the garden looked big and dark at night. Greg started commuting and Claire went part-time and busied herself to make their new rented house her home. And she was very good at that. Her wooden knitting needles were always lying around in one of the rooms, and in their bedroom, on her side of the bed, there was a box filling up with knitted booties, little hats, brassiers. But as the months passed, Claire's tummy remained as flat as a board. First, they didn't really worry about it, enjoying the momentum in the relationship, the connection that had brought them close. But when Greg came back from work, he would often find Claire at the old wooden table reading books or articles on conception. She had become slightly more guarded towards him. The love-making of the earlier months was often kept to some specific times of the months, and the rest of the time their relationship had become more functional. She often refused to go out and see old friends. She had even stopped knitting. Greg started feeling more isolated, and one morning, as he was looking for some razor blades and he had opened the bathroom cabinet that Claire used for herself, He had found a calendar attached onto the back of its door. It was full of knots and crosses and of all the hopes, disappointments and sadness she didn't really share with him anymore. He stood there for a while looking at it and realized that insouciance had been taken away from their lives. In the new year, they went to see a specialist. Quickly, the verdict came. They were never going to be able to conceive a child naturally. So at the very same meeting, they were given the chance to discuss IVF, or in vitro fertilization. The specialist explained the chances were very good and that they really should go away and discuss it together. Greg and Claire left the building hand in hand, and in her hand felt good, and he remembered why she couldn't do patisserie. Never mind about warming the butter when a hand can warm a heart. On a March morning, Claire started her hormone therapy treatment, and strangely, it put a spring back in her step. Her wooden knitting needle came out again, and she busied herself on a little rainbow blanket. When his time came, Greg went with the motions. He was left on his own in a little room with a pot and a promise of 15 minutes. But after 5 minutes, the voice of the jovial nurse behind the door was asking him in a northern accent if all was all right, pet. And yes, he politely thanked her. He would be out in no time. And indeed he was. But what he couldn't say to her was that he was yearning for the warmth of his wife under the duvet in the little apartment in Edinburgh. No sex, just to hold her and snuggle his face in the curve of her neck. He wished for that so much that it almost hurt. But he didn't say this to the jovial nurse. Instead, he thanked her and said goodbye and joined Claire, who was waiting for him in the waiting room, stern after her own procedure. As they left the clinic, he imagined the white coats, the goggles, the tubes, the measured processes. This environment he knew so well, and he wondered if right then someone was creating life in a tube. He would have liked to share that thought with Claire next to him, but somehow, although they were walking side by side, there was a distance between them. That first IVF try sadly didn't work. The days after the embryo transfer, neither Claire or he dared moving. The house felt huge and empty, full of dreaded hopes. When after 2 weeks they sat in front of each other, the pregnancy test on the wooden table between them, waiting for the blue line to appear and let the course of their future take them in its stream. When it had failed to do so, when Claire's head bent down and hit the wood of the table, he had simply stood up, held her, and told her, "We will try again." And so they did. And when the second try failed, he had done just the same. And for those 2 weeks' wait in April the following year, on their third IVF try, Greg had escaped. He couldn't really face it. No, not the weight or the expectation, but what he could see on Claire's face, what it was doing to her, the anguish, the anxiety, the fear he could read in every of her movements, expressions. So many times he had wanted to hold her tight, feel her body against his, rest his lips on the little mole in her supraclavicular fossa, and tell her that it didn't matter to him, that all that mattered to him was her, that she alone was enough for him, plentiful. She had always been. But he knew that that wasn't what she was able to hear, wanted to hear from him. So instead, as he left in the morning, he kissed her forehead and told her to be patient, that all was going to be well, and that he was there for her. And then he got into his car, waited to be on the main road, and then winded his window down, put his music full blast, and drove fast, feeling the cold spring air on his face, surfing the wind with his hand through the window. And there was that woman in the office. She was older than him, and they had been slightly flirting on and off. She was frank in the way she looked at him, and she didn't hide her desire for him. And that felt so good. And on that day in April, when she was wearing the low-cut blouse he liked, when her eyes had stopped in his, when she had asked him if he wanted to grab a drink after work, he was tempted, so tempted. Tempted to feel like a man again, wanted, desired, not needed. So he had said yes, and they had sat in a bar together. And soon, although he had tried hard, the flirting had stopped, and he had started speaking about Claire, about the IVF tries, about how it had left him feeling worthless. And she had listened. Well. And she had smiled, and she had kissed him lightly on the lips and told him to go home. When Greg reached the house, he found it dark, no lights. He walked in and switched the kitchen light on, and there at the table was Claire, her face turned away from him, as if looking through the window at the dark garden, her knitting needles laid broken in front of her. When she turned back, he couldn't really see the expression of her eyes behind the large glasses, but on the wood of the table he noticed the dark round patches left by the tears of her broken hopes. He didn't move because he couldn't. And she simply said, "That's enough, Greg. That's enough. This makes no sense. Let's go back to Edinburgh." And so in September, they moved back into their little apartment in the centre of Edinburgh. It felt the end of a journey, the beginning of a new one. They had both decided not to speak about babies for a while. Adoption could be an option in the future, who knew? And for Greg, it felt a bit like a new chance at happiness with Claire. Bit by bit, they moved back into their old habits. It felt the same but different, as if the events of the last few years had forged them into slightly different people, yet made of the same metal. And soon, Sunday mornings were spent under the duvet in the warmth of each other. Life followed its course with work, routine, friends again, and family, and December came. It was Christmas Eve. Greg had stopped on Gilmore Place at a little knitting shop. He had carefully chosen 2 thick wooden knitting needles, some deep blue wool, and a knitting bag. He had admired silently the shop assistant as she wrapped it in thick golden tissue paper, and he had appreciated the care she had taken to make the perfect bow with the red ribbon. After work, he had stayed on for the Christmas drinks with his colleagues. He had walked through the cobbled streets, all dressed in light and wonder, and had stopped for a moment to listen to the brass band of the Salvation Army playing Christmas tunes. And as he listened, it had started snowing. The homeless man next to him was slightly dancing to the sound of the brass, his face to the sky, his tongue out to catch some of the snowflakes floating in the air, moving from a foot to the other, making the sleeping bag wrapped around his waist dance around his legs. They smiled at each other, and Greg walked home, his golden present tied in its red ribbon under his arm. As he put his key in the lock of the door, he could hear some Christmas carols coming from inside the little flat. He opened the door and found Claire lying by the Christmas tree. She sat up. Her face was turned to him, all illuminated by the fairy lights. She was smiling. He walked to her and sat next to her on the floor. She told him she had a present for him and she didn't want to wait until the next day. So he said, well, I do too then, and put his golden parcel on her laps. She opened it and smiled. He didn't need to explain, she understood. And then she placed her present in his hand. It was light and small. As he unwrapped it, he understood immediately. A pregnancy test. And for having seen so many in the years before, he knew exactly where to look. And there, in front of his very eyes, and the beaming smile of the woman he loved, 2 very definite blue lines. I'm not sure if Claire started knitting that night, but Greg told me that there, under the Christmas tree, he remembered why Claire wasn't too good at patisserie. Greg and Claire now have 2 children, both naturally conceived. A boy who's 10 and a girl who is 12. She's called Eva, and in the dip of her neck, in the jugular notch or the suprasternal notch, as Greg knows it, is a small, dark mole. When they asked the fertility specialist about their natural conception, he explained that it isn't uncommon and somehow unexplainable. The great big mystery of life. But I'm left wondering, is it somehow about the power of letting go? And by doing so, of making a space for life to create in its own unexplainable enigma? I do not know, but Daryl, who went through very similar events, has something to say about it.
Going through with IVF was undoubtedly one of the most challenging and rewarding times in my life, and was a really difficult process. Financially, physically, emotionally, the whole infertility journey has definitely changed me and changed my outlook on life. It's had an impact on our marriage, both positive and negative, and perhaps has even, kind of impacted my relationship with my 2 boys. So we went through years of trying some tests through the NHS before essentially being written off and told that we wouldn't be able to have children. Naturally, our only chance would be to go through with a round of IVF, which at that time was not available on the NHS where we lived. So we began the process, and we were really fortunate that we fell pregnant and had our first little boy, Ezra, in 2020 during COVID lockdown, which the whole IVF process as a man is nowhere near as difficult as what my wife had to go through. But you're kind of just waiting around a lot. People don't really talk to you. You kind of just observe and watch and just have to be there. And then obviously you have your one job to do, and then you go back to kind of just supporting, which is difficult in itself because you want to be involved in this process and you are an equal partner in this. But it definitely didn't feel like that at the time, and looking back it still doesn't feel like that. Financially it was really tough, and that places stresses on any relationship. We were really fortunate that we were able to afford it, but a significant amount of money, and our marriage has changed because of the pressures. It's a long 4 or 5 year process of infertility, and then a really tough process of injections and tests and tablets and dieting and all sorts, that our marriage is different because of IVF. It's brought us closer together. because of the stresses that we went through, but also has changed the dynamic to some degree with us. And then we were really fortunate, despite being told we wouldn't probably be able to have children naturally, or it would very, very unlikely happen for us, that we fell pregnant out of the blue with our second born, who was born only 3 weeks ago. And that, a miracle again, just a very different type of miracle. And I love both my boys very, very much. But when Ezra was born, I didn't feel the instant connection that I feel with Joel, my second born. And I will always wonder how much of that was to do with COVID, or whether it was to do with the firstborn, and how much ultimately was to do with the whole IVF process of not really being involved as a man, kind of on the outskirts of it, and then all of a sudden this little baby's born and you're kind of thrust into the middle. But yeah, that's not to say I don't love him any less, because of course I love him very, very much, just as much as I love my other son. But yeah, IVF was a tough process, but ultimately I have no regrets going through with it. It's given me my eldest born.
Et voilà. I hope you've enjoyed Greg's story. If you have, please take a moment to rate the podcast on your app and maybe write a review. But most importantly, share it with someone that needs it. I wish you all a very happy Christmas, and I am sure, see you again in the new year in the airing cupboard. Until then, goodbye.